The other day I saw a sign on a church which said, "Jesus is the bread of life," and two questions popped into my head. The first was, but didn't Jesus say that man was not meant to live by bread alone? So what's the other thing we're supposed to have with Jesus' bread? The next question was, what kind of bread is he? Whole wheat, rye, oat bran? Because I don't know about you, but I don't want no white bread Jesus.
Jesus is here! The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is curled up asleep on the couch. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cat. Get over it. If you happen to like the podcast, you can follow it on Twitter. TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle, and it's also on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist. You can email me at trailerparkatheist@gmail.com. Show notes can be found at tparkatheist.blogspot.com. If you like the show, please rate it on iTunes. This is a news show episode where I cover stories in the news that are related to things like atheism, secularism, science, or I find just plain interesting. Next episode will be a chapter from Bible myths and their parallels in other religions. And before I get to the news, I just want to go over a couple of things. First is that it may very well get really noisy here soon. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and the sky is half of it's pitch black and half of it's sunny, so there's a good chance it'll start pouring down rain while I'm recording this, so you may hear the rain drumming on the roof after a while. The second is that the numbers of downloads are still going up, for which I'm grateful. Hope everybody enjoys it. I'm surprised people go after the older episodes, because as bad as this one is, the others are worse. And I'm still having a little bit of trouble with my computer, so hopefully I'll be able to get this edited so it sounds vaguely professional, but if it's a little thin and sketchy in spots, that's why. I had hoped to get everything sorted out with the PC this week, but it took me longer than I expected to build the front steps for my deck. I am rather proud of them. They have I put solar lights in the steps and in the handrails, so it's easy to see at night because the porch light doesn't shine all the way into the front yard. I was leaving for work one morning and came down off the step wrong and tripped on something and sprained my ankle something fierce and spent 4 days in bed with my foot propped up, just unable to move because I was in so much pain. And naturally I did it on a weekend, so there wasn't an open doctor that I could afford to get it looked at or to at least get some pain meds, but I did manage to survive. So, let's get to the news.
Snakes. Why did it have to be snakes?
Asps. Very dangerous. You go first.
Archaeology, the science which should prove the Bible if there was any truth to it, but more often than not shows that it's full of shit. First story comes from The Guardian and is archaeologists uncover vast ancient tomb in Greece. Archaeologists have unearthed a vast ancient tomb in Greece distinguished by 2 sphinxes and frescoed walls and dating to 300 to 325 BC, the government announced on Tuesday. And this shows why we need copy editors, because it should be 325 to 300 BC, guys. And what's even more embarrassing is I've reread this article about 15 times because I keep fucking up the intro and having to recut the episode, and I didn't notice that until now. But it should be 325 to 300 BC, since the dates go backwards in that point. Anyways, the tomb in the country's northeastern Macedonia region, which has been gradually unearthed over the past 2 years, marks a significant discovery from the early Hellenistic era. A cultural ministry officials said that there was no evidence yet to suggest a link to Alexander the Great, who died in 323 BC after an unprecedented military campaign through the Middle East, Asia, and Northeast Africa, or his family. The officials said the Amphipolis site, about 65 miles northeast of Greece's second biggest city, Thessaloniki, appeared to be the largest ancient tomb to have been discovered in Greece. Archaeologists began excavating the site in 2012 and expect to enter the tomb by the end of the month to determine who was buried there. Unfortunately, the article does not have any decent pictures with it. It has a photo of what I guess could be the outside of the tomb. It's a mountain that looks like it's got a modern moat around it. Maybe there's a hole in the rock that people go in. Maybe it's somewhere else. I don't know. You can't tell. I wish there was photos of the interior of the tomb, because there are some... It's really surprising sometimes what they find in there as far as artwork goes. Some years back, they found an ancient tomb in Italy that they got in there, and it had all kinds of paintings and decorations that were unlike anything they had seen before. And they were... Some of the colors and techniques, if I remember correctly, were ones that they didn't think people were using at that period of time, but obviously they were. If I can find a link to the article, I'll post it, because it's really fascinating. And if you're a fan of Neil Gaiman, the artwork is reminiscent of his, and I'm wondering, I'm not an expert on ancient art, so I don't know if any of that style of art survived in some fashion, that he could have seen it when he was studying and it influenced him, or if it's just purely a coincidence. But it's really cool. And now, a look at what's happening with religion. This story comes from the Times of India. Tamil Nadu, land of temples, is fast running out of priests. Dateline Chennai. The land of temples faces a shortage of priests, with youngsters finding the prospects of the religious calling not unlike that of the proverbial hungry artist, and the economy flush with opportunity. Several hundred temples in Tamil Nadu do not have priests to conduct rituals and look after the shrines. These days, priests hop from one temple to the other just to keep things going, even as a government scheme to train temple priests remains mired in a legal tangle. A priest in Srirangam, Ranganath Swami, that's the best I can do, and I'm not even going to attempt to try and spell it out because it's like 26 letters. Temple, who was from a family of priests in Perambalur, said all his brothers and sisters migrated to Chennai and found employment in other professions. Only I continue to be a priest, he said. The Srirangam temple is a large shrine, but many of the smaller temples in the state do not have priests today. The other day, somebody posted on Facebook or Twitter a quote, and I don't remember the exact quote or who it was by, but the gist of it was, you know, if you keep people poor, they will remain religious, which is, you know, seems to be borne out by this story. And it makes you wonder if one of the reasons why churches aren't so empty in Europe is because people are doing economically well, and they don't have a desire to go to church because they know hope lies not with praying to God, but with, their job and their society. And it would also kind of explain some of the issues with the Bible Belt in the U.S. Those states tend to have high levels of poverty, and they're also devoutly religious, or more so than the rest of the country. This, of course, doesn't answer whether it's the religion causing the poverty or poverty causing people to cling tighter to their religion. Either way, it is food for thought. The one thing that I will say is that I hope that they don't allow these temples to fall into decay. There's a couple of photos of them, and they are just amazingly ornate and colorful temples. I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of years old they are, but the artists, the craftsmanship that went into carving them and designing them is pretty impressive, and it would be a shame if they were allowed to just fall into ruin, which often happens. And the priests aren't just quitting, aren't unlike, say, the Catholic Church, where people aren't going into the priesthood because they can't be married. These priests, as the article goes on to say, talk about, the priests are allowed to marry and have children. So it's clearly the economic opportunities that are happening in India that are causing people to say, fuck the church, or fuck the temple, I'm going to get a job and make real money. So let's hope that continues. Okay, this next story comes from Kentucky.com, and it's an op-ed piece, so I realize those need to be taken with a grain of salt, but when you hear who wrote this and what it's about, I think you'll agree that it's actually a pretty informative piece. The title is Non-Christians Need Not Apply. The author is Daniel Phelps, a geologist, president of the Kentucky Paleontological Society, and vice president of Kentuckians for Science Education. So he's unlikely to be a Bible thumper. And his piece goes on to blast Kentucky for considering giving Ken Ham a tax credit worth $18 million for his amusement park called Adventure or Ark Encounter, which is, going to feature a giant Noah's Ark and maybe even the Tower of Babylon. And Ham wants the tax credits because, he says it's going to bring tourists to the area. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. One is that it's a for-profit company, so Ken Ham's so the stipulations on the Answers in Genesis website that people wishing a job there must adhere to the religious beliefs of Ken Ham is illegal. And when an atheist called a talk show Ken Ham was on and pointed this out to him, Ham lied, said, no, it's not, you're reading it wrong, it's not illegal, that's not for the park. And the atheist didn't give up, hammered away at Ham, mentioned all these things that proved it was for the park, and Ham finally hung up on him. But that's not what I found so disturbing about the article and what Ham is wanting to do. Another issue that has not been widely reported is that Answers in Genesis recently received an Allosaurus dinosaur skeleton that they value at $1 million from Michael Perutka. Until recently, Perutka was on the board of directors of the League of the South, a white supremacist neo-Confederate organization. The League of the South has been named a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. Answers in Genesis often claims it is anti-racist, but such a connection with white supremacists is indeed disturbing. And since this piece was written, I'm almost certain that Kentucky has granted them the tax credits, which is really rather repellent for a variety of reasons. And while many of us in the South will joke that you can't throw a rock without hitting a bigot, most people in the South, regardless of their feelings, have enough common sense to distance themselves from organizations which are overtly racist. They'll go for the subtle racist types like, Fox News, but they won't hang out with people who are active, who are overt racists. And most of them would have the decency to say, when they found, if they were given a substantial gift by somebody who's connected to a racist organization, to say, no, thank you, you can keep it. I realize there are exceptions to this, like Rick Perry, who didn't quite seem to understand that a ranch with a racist slur for a name was probably not a good thing to be connected with. Okay, the next story comes from ipsnews.net. Jordan's LGBT community fears greater intolerance. Dateline Amman. As the region is rocked by violence against a backdrop of the rise of radical groups, Jordan's lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community fears that new instability in the Hashemite kingdom could lead to increased intolerance towards the community. The Jabal Amman Historical District, crisscrossed by quaint streets, cafes, and art galleries, has become a hub for the Jordanian capital's LGBT community. Jordan does not have any laws against homosexuality. It does not, however, protect civil liberties for people facing discrimination on basis of their sexual preferences, says Madian, a local activist. Despite the absence of any article in Jordanian law that explicitly outlaws homosexual acts, there have been several crackdowns on members of the gay community. The targeting of the LGBT community is not something that is systematic, but it still happens from time to time, says George Aziz, head of the Arab Foundation for Freedoms and Equality. I think it was his last name is Aziz, might be Azizi, A-Z-Z-I. In October 2008, security forces in Amman launched a campaign that targets homosexuals after security forces verified that they were gathering and meeting up at a park near a private hospital in Amman, according to a study on law and homosexuality, survey and analysis of legislation across the Arab world by Walid Furchidit. In the last few years, a few arrests have been made on the margin of private parties. Most of the arrests were made under the vaguely worded indecency law and the need to respect the values of the Arab and Islamic nation, although the arrests were rarely followed by formal charges. Well, that's something. I mean, they arrest them, but they don't prosecute them or execute them. Now, the problem that is really an undercurrent here, I mean, let's face it, they're not given equal rights, but they're better off than they would be in Saudi Arabia, is the king of Jordan is not terribly popular. He doesn't speak Arabic very well, very Western in his ways, so he is precariously in power from what I understand. There's no overt threat to him at this time, although there were issues during the Arab Spring. He is probably like most leaders, and it doesn't matter whether they're in a democracy or in a dictatorship or whatever appropriate name you might want to give to a king instead of tyrant. He's probably not going to want to give up power if things start going south in that region of the world. So he may allow for tighter laws against homosexuality just to maintain his hold on power, which would be a tragedy. It does bear watching. In 1848, in Europe, there was what is known as the Year of Revolutions, which, from my limited understanding of it, bears an awful lot of resemblance to the Arab Spring we had just a few years ago. And what happened in Europe was all the various peasants rose up, overthrew their despotic regimes, the royal families that were ruling their country, attempted to set up a democracy in some cases, but no matter what form of government they tried to put in place, the end result was that they all quickly collapsed in one form or another, and those countries ended up with governments that were worse than the ones that the people were trying to replace. And in reading about this, it makes you wonder what was going on in in the heads of the leaders of the rest of the world who saw the Arab Spring, because while I'm sure some of those leaders had never heard of the Year of Revolution in the 1800s, some of them had to have. And I can't imagine that they all sat there and thought, and didn't think, this sounds like the year of the revolutions, and we know what happened after that. Maybe we need to do something differently than what happened in the 1800s so that these countries don't become more despotic. But that doesn't seem to have happened. Some of the countries, I guess, are slightly better off, but here in the States, we don't get a hell of a lot of news about them, so we don't really know. There is still fighting between various factions in Libya, and that's not including the shit that's going on in Syria and Iraq with ISIS, which some of that can be said to be a product of this, and Egypt is still sort of weird. I mean, they're having issues with, they had a coup, and we're not getting any news here, at least here in the States, about what's going on with the Egyptian government, although they seem to be more repressive from the little bits that I have heard. So, it's concerning. It's stuff that we all need to pay attention to, because, let's remember what happened back in 2001, and 2003. The religious nut jobs from the Islamic world attacked us in 2001, and the religious nut jobs in the Western world said, we got to launch a crusade and we got to go get them Muslims. And, absolutely our invasion of Afghanistan was totally justified by the events of 9/11, but then we promptly fucked everything up by going into Iraq, a country which did not have WMDs, and which, if people had studied their history, they would know that the military operation the U.S. exercised against Iraq obviously indicated that the people in charge of the military knew the Iraqis didn't have WMDs. There was, I can't remember, well, skip the name of the program, idiot. In World War II, the Norwegians had a dam that was generating electricity, and they used that to produce heavy water, which is necessary to produce a nuclear weapon. When the Germans occupied Norway, the Allies made stopping those operations at that dam a priority. They spent, I don't know how many millions of dollars and how many and how many missions to take out that that Norwegian heavy water plant. But they sent a number of forces out there on what they knew would be suicide missions to try and take that dam out. When, I can remember hearing us, the news accounts as we were invading Iraq, and it's like, okay, we know where the WMDs are. Why aren't we hearing accounts of forces being dropped into those cities to try and capture those WMDs before they're being, before they're either used or taken out of the country? Well, the reason we didn't hear about them is because the people in charge knew that we didn't have the fucking bomb. That the Iraqis didn't have WMDs. Or if you want to be kind about it, you have to say, well, the people in charge were fucking incompetent, and they genuinely believed that the Iraqis had WMDs, but they had no idea how to properly handle it. That still doesn't make them look good. And if people understood history, they would know. That's the kind of thing you look for. Well, if the enemy has a really serious weapon, that's your first priority when you attack them. And I will put in the show notes about those a link to the Wikipedia page about those operations on that Norwegian dam, because it's fascinating. And the people, men and women, risked their lives, and many of them died trying to take that dam out. And I mean, it was a very near thing for them to actually destroy it. There was even an operation after the dam had been destroyed. They had discovered that, we got the dam, but there was enough heavy water that the Germans can use it, so they're going to be the Germans are going to be shipping the heavy water out. So we had to send, by we, I mean the Allies, I don't believe there were any Americans involved in this particular mission, send covert forces into Norway again to blow up the ship that was hauling that heavy water so that Germans couldn't get it. I know there's been a couple of documentary-style television programs about it, but I don't think there's been I don't think there's been a movie about it, and it would be a good movie to make because of the sacrifices made. Okay. Enough of my babbling. Next story. This comes from Ars Technica. Ohio lawmakers want to limit the teaching of the scientific process. Science educators have recognized that teaching science as a large compendium of facts without reference to the scientific process and theories that bind them together simply leads to uninterested and uninformed students. Okay, I'm going to inject here. That's kind of how we teach math now, at least in my experience. I mean, I have had one good teacher who taught math, but he wasn't a math teacher. He was a computer science teacher. But most of my math classes have been like that, and everybody in the class has gone, we don't understand any of this stuff. It's all just chicken scratch. Okay, my little interjection's done now. So it's a bit mind-boggling to discover that an Ohio state legislature is attempting to block educators from teaching anything about the scientific process. And for good measure, the bill's sponsor threw politics and creationism into the mix. Oh, yes, because those are just such important things. The bill, currently under consideration by the Ohio Assembly, is intended to revoke a previous approval of the Common Core educational standards, which target math and literacy. However, the bill's language also includes sections devoted to science and social studies, and the science one is a real winner. And here's the quote from the bill. The standards in science shall be based in core existing disciplines of biology, chemistry, and physics, incorporate grade-level mathematics and be referenced to the mathematics standards, focus on academic and scientific knowledge rather than scientific processes, and prohibit political or religious interpretation of scientific facts in favor of another. And now we're back to the article. Specifically prohibiting a discussion of the scientific process is a recipe for educational chaos. To begin with, it leaves the knowledge the kids will still receive, the things we have learned through science, completely unmoored from any indication of how that knowledge was generated or whether it's likely to be reliable. The scientific process is also useful in that it can help people understand the world around them and the information they're bombarded with. It can also help people assess the reliability of various sources of information. Holy shit, God forbid that the fucking proletariat masses actually are able to comprehend something and work things out on their own. No, fuck that. Prohibiting quote, political or religious interpretation of scientific facts, unquote, however, opens up a large can of worms. People who believe the Earth is less than 10,000 years old frequently claim that they work with the same facts as actual geologists and biologists. They simply interpret them differently. Although the wording of the bill is vague, it could be interpreted as blocking educators from pointing out how completely inconsistent with the data this interpretation is, or prevent them from describing how the evidence favors a 4 billion year old Earth. Now, I grew up in Ohio. I actually got a pretty good education in Ohio, despite the fact that I came from a really small and poor school district. I don't know if I mentioned it on previous episode, but my history textbook when I was in middle school was the same history textbook that my brothers, who were 10 and 15 years older than me, had used. Same edition, everything. I didn't have their copy. I had somebody else's copy from their class, and that textbook was out of date when they had it. It had it listed the current pope. I don't remember his name now, but the current pope that it talked about had died before I was born. So that gives you an idea of how far out of date it was. And I never had too many overtly religious teachers in the sense that they drug a religion where it didn't belong. I had a science teacher who was actually fairly good. He had some issues with evolution, but he never once blathered on about religion or anything like that in class. Although I did have my middle school history teacher. She did do that. I can remember the day after Anwar Sadat was assassinated, in I think it was 1979 when he was assassinated. We went to her class, and I don't remember where we were in the book, but we were in the ancient world, and she stops the class and says, today we're going to talk about some current events because of things that have happened in the world recently, may be an indication of the last days. Which was like, okay, this is kind of creepy and weird. And then she proceeded to talk about, the assassination of Anwar Sadat. And I don't remember too much of the discussion in that class, that particular class, about it. I did have some doubts about the whole thing with religion and Christianity at that point. I can remember when our class got to the section in the book entitled Christians, and it was to deal with the influence Christianity had on world history. I couldn't help but think, well, that's a pretty shallow way, or pretty blatantly transparent way of getting your religion into the classroom, which that kind of bothered me, even though I was a Christian at the time. And then we were talking about something in class, and the teacher, somehow the subject of the veracity of the Bible came up. I don't remember what it was. I just remember me asking, well, how do we know the Bible's true? And the teacher snapped at me, and a couple other kids snapped at me, that because it says it's true. Which I thought was really a kind of circular argument, but I got shouted down before I could ask any more questions. And that teacher and I didn't get along too well. One time, after answering too many questions correctly in class, she snapped at me, "Mr. Drake, you don't know all the answers." Or, no, I'm sorry. "Mr. Drake, you don't know everything." And I, being the smartass that I was, I responded with, I know I don't know everything, because if I did know everything, I wouldn't be here. I did not like her at all. She used to stand in front of the class, and she had, I remember this she had long fingernails, and while she was standing in front of the class, she would take her index finger, jam it up in her nostrils, and just root around for boogers, and roll them off her fingers onto the floor constantly. And it was like, And she was overweight and would wear very tight polyester pants, and she would rub her groin area with her nails and just not a pleasant woman. And that is one of the many reasons why I didn't like school as a kid. Okay. So, but anyways, the article goes on to describe that the legislator is saying that, oh, well, yes, it'll allow intelligent design in the classroom, his bill, and he says, oh, no, and then later on he says, no, but it won't put creationism in the classroom. And he makes some bizarre arguments as to why agricultural productivity makes climate change a political story. I don't... Apparently it hasn't passed yet, but, and I'm not sure how politics are going in Ohio these days, so I don't know how likely it is this guy will pass it, but it bears watching. Okay, the next story comes from IndianExpress.com. Stalked and harassed Rotac teens end lives and American dream. One scored 97% on her Class X exams and was hoping to make it to a good college in Gurgaon. The other checked her bangle box regularly to see if she had saved enough money to buy her sister a T-shirt. Both shared a dream, a life in America, a world removed from Rotac. On Monday, the two dreams died. Stalked and harassed by a group of young men who followed them to their coaching institute and back, Nikita Duhan, 17, and her friend Madhu, 16, ended their lives after allegedly poisoning themselves. In notes they left behind, the girls said they were so troubled that they could not concentrate on studies and were scared they would not be able to perform and make it to the United States. Police said the two girls laced mango drinks with what appeared to be toxic chemicals and downed them in one go while they were at the institute. Suspecting food poisoning, the institute staff rushed them to PGI Rotac, only to be told that they should alert the parents and police since this appeared to be a case of suicide. The article goes on to describe how the girls died very quickly, and it describes that the girls left suicide notes in which they recount being harassed and pursued by these guys, and they give information, and apparently nobody really was willing to help them against these guys, and the girls had picked up a bad reputation. Now, of course, part of this is the religion. There's a number of religious factors here with this. There's the whole, well, women got to remain virgins until they get married bullshit. There's the fact that in places like India, China, and other countries, there is a stigma against being a woman, and they are doing... it's banned in India, but of course it still happens. For the longest time, it was really prevalent in India. When parents would do ultrasounds and find out that they were going to have a daughter, they would abort the child. The same thing happens in China, and in both countries, they are now reached a point where there are the ratio of males to females is such that there are like 10 males for every female, and there's a huge controversy in China because they're importing Asian women from other countries, which is creating the problem in those countries where there's no, there's not enough women, and that some people suspect that attitude is what, or the lack of women in a society like India is what leads to those horrific stories of, the mass gang rapes that have been happening in the news. Not to mention the whole misogynistic culture that exists in those countries where, until wider pressure was brought to bear, the police really didn't care that a woman got raped. And, I realize that I'm just blathering on mainly to Europeans and Westerners about this, but, we're, at least here in the U.S. and my part of the country, we're not terribly far from that. I know plenty of people who make just mind-boggling misogynistic comments, even about their own children. One guy I knew, he, talked about when he, how his daughter would, try to participate things that he was doing with his sons, and he's like, well, and she's a girl, so she can't do them very well. And it's like, that's just bullshit. But I don't know. This stuff gets me mad and inarticulate, which makes me feel awkward, because I know we don't believe that shit like this can happen in our country, and yet, we have incidences that sometimes are shockingly similar to it, and we have people who have misogynistic views. There was that whole bullshit with the legitimate rape asshole, and I get so frustrated. Sorry. And, the one gal did really well on her exams, and it's a shame. There was an account I read some years ago about how in parts of India the tradition is if you're a widow, you're not allowed to remarry, and they have a village it's called something like the widow's village. Essentially what it is if you're a woman and your husband dies, doesn't matter how old or young you are, you're not allowed to be remarried, and you're exiled to this village. And I just can't help but think, and of course, they have limited opportunities in that village, and, all kinds of other problems, and I just can't help but think, why isn't there an aid organization just saying, okay, we're going to take these women, we're going to send them to a developed country, or somewhere where they can be allowed to be productive members of society, and they're allowed to, live a decent life. And people are like, and the responses I've got is, well, no, the people in that area, in those areas in India, should just come to accept that those women have a decent life, blah blah blah. And it's like, yes, you're right, absolutely. That society should say there's nothing wrong with being a widow. You should be allowed to marry, have a normal life, be an equal part of society. But that's not going to happen overnight. And until it does happen, those women are just going to be stuck in that village and rot. They're going to have lives where they're deprived of, basic things in some cases, food, companionship, whatever you want to, you name that we have in life. These people, those women aren't going to be able to experience that fully because they're so isolated by their society. And, we don't live in a perfect world, so we need to look at things recognizing that it's an imperfect world, and what can we do to solve these problems. And I have to say that if, you took those women from that village and you brought them to some place, whether it be a Western society or some other part of India, where they could live a normal life, and then, communicate with the relatives back home and say, hey, I'm here. This is all the benefits I get from being here. I have a job. I have a husband again. I have, my own house or whatever. That will have an impact on those people in the village, because they'll be saying, well, shit, they're going off and they're having a great life. Maybe we shouldn't be throwing these women away. That will help to change, that potentially will help to change things. And even if it doesn't, it makes those poor women's lives better by bringing them to some place where they can be functional members of a society. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Tea Earl Grey hot.
3D printing news. The ability to make nearly anything with the same ease as printing a document has powerful implications for our future. This first story comes from RichardDawkins.net. World's first 3D printed vertebra implanted in a 12-year-old boy. Doctors at Peking University in China have accomplished something never before seen in medicine. They have successfully replaced a section of vertebra with a 3D printed implant. Doctors say this implant should incorporate itself better with the existing bone and shorten recovery time. Don't get too excited about all the bones you're going to print at home. This implant is made from powdered titanium, which you can't really feed into your MakerBot. Now, I find this story particularly interesting, not merely because it deals with 3D printing, but 20 years ago, I had a friend who essentially committed suicide, who, in the years before he died, had been in tremendous pain because he was in an auto accident and broke one of the vertebrae in his back. And it broke at such a position that they didn't catch it on the initial x-rays, and by the time they did figure out, it was too late to fully repair the problem, and he spent the rest of his life in pain. That's probably one of the reasons which led to his suicide. And I look at that and I have to wonder if it wouldn't have helped him had this technology been around. It's not the first bone implant that's been done. It's the first vertebra. Some years ago, in one of the northern European countries like Sweden or Norway, I don't remember exactly where, may have been Denmark, there was a woman who, in her 80s, who'd lost her jaw due to cancer, and they 3D printed her one out of titanium and put that in place. I don't know if that's... Well, no, I take that there's more than that, because they've done several, not metal, but they've done several plastic skull caps for people who've lost sections of their skull due to disease or accident. They've 3D printed out a replacement section to implant in them. Just a simple technology in the sense that it's becoming more and more common, and it's dramatically changing people's lives. Those of you who know who Roger Ebert was know that he didn't have a jaw, and he'd lost his through cancer, and despite efforts to make him an artificial jaw using bone from his shoulder, those all failed. And he spent the rest of his life eating through a tube. Had he been able to get a 3D printed jawbone, he might have been able to eat and speak during his later years. Okay, this next story comes from 3dprint.com, and I do apologize for being a little dark in the past bit here. This is actually a pretty nifty story. It is the headline is DF3D creates exquisite high-end 3D printed chess pieces using SLA technology. For those of you who don't know, there's a couple of different types of 3D printing. There's the extrusion, which is like an inkjet printer. And then there's SLA, which you have a tank of liquid and a laser goes by, and as the laser hits the liquid, it solidifies it into a plastic. There's a few other variations, but those are the two main types. Each one has their pros and cons, and I think at some point we're going to see machines that are capable of doing all of those operations. SLA, extrusion, I don't know exactly what the others call. Some of the others are called, but they'll also have a machining center built in as well. Anyways, On to the article. Ever since 3D printing began to become more popular, there has been a plethora of chess sets and chess pieces popping up on websites like Thingiverse, which has their own special section devoted to the popular game, as well as on Shapeways. What is so great about 3D printing is that it allows for complete customization of objects, as well as the creation of niche-type chess sets. If you want a chess set made up of sea creatures, there is one for that. If you want a chess set featuring pawns that sit on toilets, there is even one for that. What if you want a really high-end 3D printed chess set, though? One that is exquisite and detailed at the same time. Thanks to a company called DF3D, there is now an answer. The company's co-founder and director, Deepak Raj, and his team have come up with quite the extraordinary set. They're fucking beautiful. The chess pieces the pawns are skeleton warriors holding a shield. It's like a round shield with 4 notches cut out in it. They've got a sword. They've got a helmet. The knights are armored horses. It's just from about the midsection of the horse up, and it looks like they're rearing back. The bishop, the king, the queen, and whatever the other royal pieces are. I don't play chess. I've tried to learn when I was a kid, but I never really got into it for whatever reason. They're all skeleton warriors in armor, holding the bishops are holding staffs. The king is holding a sword. The queen is holding a sword, and the other special piece is holding a sword as well. They are now. I spent a number of years working for a foundry, and we did lost wax casting. So I have some experience with mold making for injection molding, as well as casting process, and most of these pieces could not be done with either conventional machining. Well, you could get close with conventional machining, but the amount of hours required to produce them would make these things exorbitantly expensive, and that you wouldn't be able to get them exact, because in the photographs you can see there is just a massive amount of fine detail that they have put in. Really, really incredible. And the cost of the pieces, they're let me find them. They're not cheap. They range from $110 for a soldier up to $300 for the king. Okay, that's expensive, but there's no way you could machine aspects of them, but you'd never get this level of detail. You could do a combination of casting with machining. You really couldn't get. You could get about halfway there in terms of levels of detail. This is an illustration of how it brings the costs, how this technology brings the costs down. Because yes, it's $100 to $300 a piece, but if you were to try to manufacture it in any other way except for having somebody just hand carve these pieces, and even then they wouldn't be able to do as well with some of the aspects. You're talking tens of thousands of dollars for the pieces. And I don't mean the whole set, I mean the individual pieces, because there is just a massive amount of machining and engineering and design work that would have to go into these to make them using anything other than 3D printing. So essentially, even though a full chess set would be several thousands of dollars, you've taken something that would be priceless or impossible to create and made it affordable to wealthy individuals. That's pretty remarkable. It's amazing, and even though I don't play chess, I wish I had the money for one, because damn, it's hella beautiful.
I am endeavoring, ma'am, to construct a mnemonic memory circuit using stone knives and bearskins.
Okay, third world news. This section is where I cover news of interesting technological developments in the third world. As someone who grew up listening to missionaries talk about how they, quote, helped, unquote, people in the third world by teaching them about Jesus, I like to raise awareness of actual good being done in such places by people. This segment is brought to you with the help of Foundation Beyond Belief. Foundation Beyond Belief is a 501c3 charitable foundation created to focus, encourage, and demonstrate humanist generosity and compassion. They select and feature 5 charitable organizations per quarter, one in each of the following cause areas: education, poverty and health, human rights, the natural world, challenge the gap, charities based in other worldviews. Members join the foundation by signing up for a monthly automatic donation in the amount of their choice, then set up personal profiles to indicate how they would like their contribution distributed among the 5 categories. Active members can advocate for causes and help the foundation choose the new beneficiaries each quarter. They also host a multi-author blog focused on humanism, philanthropy, and the intersection of the two. Carefully selected for impact and efficiency, their featured beneficiaries are secular organizations with the exception of Challenge the Gap, which features non-proselytizing organizations based in other worldviews. At the end of each quarter, all donations designated for their featured charities are forwarded, no percentages retained, and a new slate of beneficiaries selected. The foundation also sponsors Volunteers Beyond Belief, a network of humanist volunteer teams in 23 U.S. cities, and Humanist Crisis Response, raising funds and awareness for major humanitarian crises worldwide. Now, I also want to add that I get no compensation from them for doing this. I just ask them for some suggestions because, as I said, I find this... I like talking about organizations doing actual good in the developing world, and I figured they wouldn't be bothered by me being an atheist and would provide me with some information, since it is kind of hard for a yokel like myself in the middle of ass rape America to find this information out. And they have given me a number of leads, but I think I may have to split this out of the podcast and make it its own podcast under a different name because, well, in certain areas I get the feeling that people aren't too happy in talking with me because when I mention, well, I have this podcast called the Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast, I tend not to hear from them again. So I may, if I can think up a good name and I can afford it, I'll split it off into its own little podcast. But I'll still keep covering it in this feed as well. Anyways, the first story comes from the fastcoexist.com website. A maintenance-free bike to give Africans some mobility. Buffalo Bicycles, a winner of a recent Chicago Innovation Award, won't break down for 5 years and fit almost anyone's. Kids going to school, entrepreneurs to bring goods to markets, and healthcare workers who visit patients on their bikes. It's a two-wheeled piece of social change. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami left thousands of people stranded with ruined infrastructure, putting basic needs, healthcare, school, building materials out of reach. So bicycle components manufacturer SRAM Corporation founded World Bicycle Relief, and through partnerships with aid organizations brought more than 24,000 bicycles to people in Sri Lanka. The organization has since expanded its bike giving to Africa, where the bikes are used by kids to get to school, entrepreneurs to bring goods to market, and healthcare workers who visit patients on two wheels. Producers, too, are local and assemble all the bicycles in factories in Zimbabwe, Kenya, Zambia, and South Africa. And mechanics trained by the organization fix bikes wherever problems pop up. The bike is, it's not terribly stylish looking. They weigh 55 pounds, but they can haul 200 pounds. And, I mean, they they look fairly rugged. Article doesn't mention any modifications that people have done to those bikes, but I know that in other countries, well, in various countries in the developing world, they have taken bicycles and used them to make centrifuges for clinics. I'll post a link to it. There's a guy who's got an adapter for bike that can be easily added to bicycles that allows them to be used to power things like a circular saw, rice thresher, and other things. Granted, it's not as good as powerful as a gas or diesel engine, but it's cheaper to maintain, and you're not polluting as much with a bicycle as you are with a diesel engine or a gasoline engine, and especially if it's a 2-cycle gasoline engine. The final story comes from Ecoterra.com. This 99-year-old makes a new dress every day for a child in need. 99-year-old Lillian Weber is on a mission to make 1,000 dresses for impoverished children in Africa. The impressive senior citizen has been whipping up one dress a day, sewing the garments by hand in her Iowa home. Weber has already sewn 840 dresses for non-profit Little Dresses for Africa and hopes to reach her goal to make 1,000 little girls happy. Weber began sewing her dresses in 2011 when she and a group of friends over 80 years old began supporting Little Dresses for Africa. Each morning, Weber begins a new dress sewing all morning until taking a well-deserved afternoon break. After lunch, she finishes the piece, adding personal touches. Each dress is made with pride. Weber adds detailed accents to make each little girl who receives it feel special. All of her dressmaking has gotten Weber a nomination for local stations WQAD TV's Pay It Forward Award. Nearing her 100th birthday, Weber plans to continue her daily dresses well into her 100s. Thanks to people like Weber, Little Dresses for Africa has collected more than 2.5 million dresses that have been distributed to orphanages in 47 countries across Africa, as well as the United States, Haiti, Thailand, Mexico, and Honduras. And the dresses aren't, at least they're the ones that they show, they're not terribly sophisticated. They basically, at least this one that they show, as I said, they may have others. It's literally a pillowcase that they modify to be a dress for a little girl, which of course beats wearing nothing at all. But I found that fascinating because my maternal grandmother, after my grandfather died, she didn't really have much to do. She couldn't drive. She was born in 1900, so as she was growing up, women weren't generally taught how to drive, especially not poor women like she was. And so after he died, she sat around the house, and I wish there was something like this around, because it would have given her something to do, and it would have helped children in need, and I'm sure she would have liked that. I may forward this to my mother, since she's in her 80s, and she had all boys, and the only one of us boys who's had a kid also had a boy. So I know she's complained about not having a daughter or a granddaughter, so she may want to do that. Of course, she travels all the time now, so she might not be interested in doing that. Okay, that's it for this episode of the Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can follow the show on Twitter. TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle, and it's also on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist. You can email me at trailerparkatheist@gmail.com. Show notes can be found at tparkatheist.blogspot.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. The next episode will be a chapter from Bible myths and their parallels in other religions. Say goodnight, Fuzznuts. Damned cat.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.